This year marks the 70th anniversary of the military alliance between Korea and the United States. But the people-to-people ties between the two go much deeper. In 1903, 120 years ago, the first Korean set foot in Hawaii. Since then, the Korean diaspora in the U.S. has grown to become a central force in the U.S. and an important bridge between the two countries. Our globalist today is Joseph Juhn, a documentary director, a Korean-American himself, who has focused his efforts on depicting the story of the Korean diaspora, most recently in the U.S.
폭도들이 약탈한 후에 불을 지금 질렀다고 합니다. 그래서 상당히 많은 우리 교포들이 거의 지금 피해를 본 것으로 그렇게 지금 전해지고 있습니다. 한국 사람들이 경영하는 마켓이나 리커 스토어 모두 약탈을 당하고 전소가 거의 됐다고 합니다.
이제는 교포들의 이익을 대변해줄 정치인이 필요하다. 그런 목소리도 높이고 있다면서요.
최근까지 미국의 주의회 또는 연방의회에 진출한 우리 교포는 아직 한 사람도 없습니다.
우리 4.19 때 아무도 우리 프레젠티브 하는 사람이 없어서 우리 차세대들이 정치인을 해주면 참 좋겠다. 이게 우리의 희망이었어.
Never before have there been 5 congressional candidates of Korean descent running at the same time.
I think the fundamental question is, why are you doing this? What motivates someone like me or David or Young or Marilyn, Michelle to run for Congress to start with? And who do they want to fight for?
Joseph tells us why he is so passionate about telling the Korean diaspora story and why it is so vital to understand their struggles and their successes.
You talk about the American dream. My family story is the American dream. Who I am and how I was raised really prepared me to do this work.
I think right now it's very important to give people who've come to this country an opportunity to pursue the American dream, just like what my parents did.
I am an immigrant myself, and I've lived my American dream, and collectively, we are making sure that the next generation would also have the opportunity to realize that American dream.
Oh my gosh, 우리 아들 때문에 내가 사네 이제. Oh my gosh, 우리 아들이 한국에 살린다.
We are Korean Americans. We can represent.
This is a time where we're all asking ourselves very big questions about who we are and where we come from and what our role is.
Welcome, Joseph, to The Globalist.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Your second documentary, Chosen, was released in Korea about 6 months ago or so.
Right.
It's about the 2020 U.S. Congress elections in which 5 Korean Americans made a bid. So what was the reaction like in Korea?
I think one of the more dominating sort of feedback that I received was how little Koreans knew of the history and the plight of Korean Americans and the challenges that they face. Because you might be aware, the way Koreans think of Koreans living in America is that we're out there to achieve American dreams, own big houses, get good education and so forth.
They're the fortunate ones.
That's right. But that's not the right picture necessarily. One of the bedrocks of my film is the 4.19, the 1992 LA riots. I think when Los Angeles riots gets discussed in the States, it's still very much of a black and white issue, and there's hardly any Korean American voice in that larger narrative. So I think for Koreans, watching those events unfold and how we were able to overcome those struggles was an enlightenment, an educational
But you tell this story through this process of these 5 Korean American congressmen to be's and their campaign process. Why did you pick them as your subjects?
To tell you the genesis of why I wanted to work on Chosen to begin with, I read a book by John Bolton 3 years ago.
Yes. Was that the room where it happened?
Yes, exactly. John Bolton, mind you, he was a security advisor for President Trump. And he talks about in his memoir the 2018 Hanoi summit between Trump and Kim Jong-un. And you probably remember this very clearly, but
I actually talked to John Bolton about that.
Did you really?
Yes.
My goodness. Not just Koreans, but members of Korean diaspora all around the world were glued to the televised event. And if not reunification, then at least peace on the Korean Peninsula was on the brink. What happened instead was that the peace talks failed. And, John Bolton basically talks about why the peace talks failed. And he basically says it's because of the impulsive decision by Trump, Pompeo, and Bolton.
Yes.
When I was reading those lines, I realized the fate of an entire country, region, literally was hinged upon the decision of a few policymakers in the U.S. I started hypothesizing, what if those positions were occupied by Korean Americans? And that's when I read the newspaper that there are 5 Korean Americans running for U.S. Congress, and I thought maybe they're the solution to Korea's peace. It's a wild hypothesis, but I wanted to test that hypothesis by following their footsteps, what their identity was, what their solution to the Korea peace was, and things of that nature.
So your thinking was that if it was in the hands of Korean Americans, it might have been different. That it might not have been just, oh well, it didn't work, out the door type of thing that Bolton said it was.
Absolutely, because they have personal relationship to Korea. And I think that knowledge, that intimacy, that affinity would have rendered a more peaceful policy towards their mother country.
I guess sort of the case in point is that of the 5 that you followed in Chosun, 4 actually made it into Congress, and they made it again in 2 years after you followed them.
Right.
So they must have been doing something right. Which is also mentioned, I guess, in President Yoon Suk-yeol went to the United States and made his speech, and he mentioned them.
Representatives Young Kim, Andy Kim, Michelle Steele, and Marilyn Strickland are here with us. They are a testament to the alliance spanning generations.
As sort of this bridge between Korea and the United States, do you think despite their differences in political spectrum, they can still serve that function?
Absolutely. I'm a firm believer that it's still better to have Korean American representation on the Hill, irrespective of their ideological difference, unless you have a very toxic ideology, then maybe that's a different question. But another good example of people of different worldview coming together to pass a deal, a bill that affects us commonly was all 4 of them came together to vote to pass a anti-Asian American hate bills. So there are areas where the 4 can definitely come together for same common goals and values. But in terms of any policies that where ideology has a room to play a role, I've noticed a diverging sort of path from those 4 Korean American congressional members. So it's very complicated, right? Yeah. I wish it was more black and white, so everything would fit into my hypothesis, but it's not, and it's a learning curve for me too.
Yeah. When you first shot this documentary, you didn't know whether they would be successful or not. So I guess you were shooting on the hopes that they would all be successful. I mean, the 4 that you have, I think the one that did make it, actually, ironically, the sort of the main player in your documentary is David.
Yeah.
And I heard that he was going to make his third attempt at U.S. Congress in 24. What do you think the future of Korean Americans in the U.S. political spectrum is?
Your point about how the film actually revolves around the only person who doesn't make into Congress is very telling, because I happen to believe, for many reasons, that David-Kim, the only underdog, the only person who doesn't make it, has identities that are shunned, perhaps, in the larger Korean American community. He identifies as a member of LGBTQ, and he's the youngest out of the 5 that I covered. He's a second generation, the son of a pastor, extremely progressive in his worldview and his values and beliefs. And so he had a lot of disadvantages going into this race. And yet he almost pulled off an upset.
This is 2022.
As well.
Yeah.
Obviously, when Korean Americans make into Congress, Korean news media covers their success stories.
Sure.
But Korean America is a culmination and combination of so many different struggles and failures and sacrifice and silence as well. And so how do we honor that? How do we pay tribute to those who came before, did not make into the news, but still provided enough platforms for us to succeed, right? And I think highlighting more underdogs, I feel like that's my calling almost.
I mean, Korea does put a lot of emphasis on their diaspora, Koreans living abroad. They're going to set a ministry just to take their affairs into account. Your observations about, the diaspora, what do you feel is something that such a ministry, such a government organization from the Korean side needs to take into account when they deal with diaspora?
I read a statistics recently by the U.S. News and World Report, and ranked country based on the racist sentiment. Can you guess where South Korea ranked?
Racist sentiment.
Yeah, so number 1 is quote unquote most racist.
Okay.
And 79 is the least racist.
Maybe somewhere in the middle?
I was hoping that would be the case.
Okay.
But unfortunately, Korea ranked 9th out of the 79 countries. And one of the questions in the survey was that, do you want non-ethnic Koreans to live as your neighbor? 30% of the respondents said, we don't want a non-Korean living next door. I think the number is staggering, right? As much as I want to believe that Korea promotes diversity, immigration, hospitable, welcoming towards foreigners and immigrants, I happen to believe that we have a really long way to go. You mentioned that Koreans are interested in the stories of Korean diaspora, and certainly so if you look at Pachinko or Minari or other, Beef just came out, which is predominantly Korean American cast. But the stories of Korean ethnic Chinese people, for instance, or to a certain degree, Korean adoptees, biracial Koreans, I don't think they're covered. In fact, I think Koreans have a very hostile attitude towards 조선족 Korean ethnic Chinese, and maybe 탈북자들. Of course, creation of the ministry can be one of the ways to resolve that, but I think even bigger homework is perhaps educating or raising awareness within Korea about the existence of Koreans overseas and their symbolic value. As much as we care for Koreans living overseas, I think we also need to care about non-ethnic Korean diaspora who reside in Korea as rightful members of this community too.
People like you actually do need to raise your voice and participate in the process like this, because you are very much a part of both in a way.
My name is Joseph Juhn. I was a New York attorney. At the end of 2015, I went on a backpacking trip to Cuba, where I ran into a Korean Cuban by chance. This one serendipitous encounter changed my life completely. I ended up obsessing over the history and the current state of Koreans in Cuba. one man in particular, Jeronimo Lim. And I spent the next 4 years tracing his footsteps.
나는 이문조입니다. 하바나에 삽니다. 오늘 기쁜 날입니다.
So, talking about your first documentary, Jeronimo, it came out of your visit to Cuba. But when you were visiting Cuba, you were a lawyer. You didn't go to produce a documentary. But that trip sort of turned you from your legal profession into this documentary film career, yes. What flipped you?
Well, the funny thing is, I up until this day, I still never made a conscious decision to become a storyteller full-time.
You're not a lawyer.
I'm not a lawyer, although I do have my license. I'm paying my dues.
You're not a practicing lawyer.
I'm not a practicing lawyer, but I keep that possibility open because it doesn't make sense financially to be a full-time documentary.
It doesn't make financial sense.
No, not at all. Initially, it was a passion project. I went to Cuba on a backpacking trip, intending to have fun with no particular plan. But I ran into a Korean-Cuban descendant by chance, who was a taxi driver who was driving me from the airport to the hostel. The next day, she invited me to her house, and I got to meet all her family members and spent the whole day with them. I was a complete stranger to them. I was a hostile guest, and yet they showed me the level of hospitality that I've never experienced before. And Patricia's mom, who is the mother of the taxi driver, was telling me the legacy and the story of her late husband as if I was the last remaining hope of this story getting out to the world. She's all excited to share with me the living history. Her husband won 9 medals.
He worked high job in Cuba.
Is this your name, Imunjo?
My husband.
Your husband's name, I see. I mean, undoubtedly the most profound experience I've had in my life. And initially, I just wanted to share my experience with a few of my friends. So I went back intending that I'm going to make a 20-minute YouTube clip, which turned into a 3-year documentary journey.
And this person that was the main character of all of these stories happened to be who's part of Castro's cabinet and then later worked for the Korean-Cuban community to help them find their identity, which is wildly coincidental.
Sure. Why I wanted to tell the story of Jeronimo Lim, why I became obsessed with his legacy was because I felt like he lived through the identity crisis that so many of my peers experience currently, which is how do you deal with this dual identities, right? He was 100% Cuban, 100% Korean, but more, he was cosmopolitan, he was a humanist. How was he able to overcome this dualistic worldview and become something more? How can he transcend his identity confinements? He seemed to have figured it out, and I wanted to know how he was able to overcome that.
It was a question you had.
It was a question I had. Not only did I have it, I have been lucky for whatever reasons to travel to different places where I always ran into Korean diaspora, whether it's Brazil, Germany, South Africa, Middle East, China, and so many more. And identity crisis was something not only did I go through, but so many of second, third, fourth, fifth generation go through from cradle to their deathbed, trying to make sense of what it means to be Korean outside of Korea. Right? That's why I thought, okay, this will be not only a service to my own enlightenment and journey, but to so many others around me too.
That kind of diaspora identity crisis, it must not be limited to Koreans living overseas, as you say.
Absolutely.
But it seems to be a topic of a lot of, I guess, Hollywood movies that have been very successful, and books. We talked about, you mentioned Pachinko. We have Minari, which is also a big movie in the United States. Is there a story about this Korean diaspora that is resonating with people around the world, or is it the uniqueness? What do you think? Why do you think it's such a popular subject?
I think there's an element of universality, not just in Korean diasporic narratives, but in all diasporic narratives. Whether you are a member of diaspora or not, I think it's fair to say all of us, right? All of us go through feeling of isolation, depression, discrimination, loneliness, and so forth, right? And I think members of diaspora are more subject, more vulnerable to this type of emotional conditions. So Korean diasporic narrative, the reason I think it resonates so well globally is because it contains a universal concept. Quite a while ago, I think a couple of years ago, when Pachinko was at its height, I think one of the newspapers claimed Pachinko as one of the K-culture products. I wrote an op-ed saying, please don't claim the stories of diaspora as your own. It's more than Korea as a country. It's a universal. It belongs to the diaspora, not to the country. And I think we need to start cultivating this type of mindset where we have our full ownership. We're not a spoken object, we're speaking subjects, right?
True, but a lot of the more successful Korean cultural products deal with very universal subjects, and so
that's true.
It's a weird box to put them into one box.
That's true.
And for you, I mean, I guess because you are diaspora, and those are the questions that have really driven you for a long time, is it helpful or not helpful to be so invested in a subject that you are actually making a documentary of?
You're right. I don't want to put myself into the framework and the box of diaspora alone. I think it would be defeating the very purpose of telling a diasporic storytelling. And yet, it's been gratifying to me. First and foremost, it's not an often talked about subject matter. I think the only person that I'm relatively well aware of who's telling her story specifically from the perspective of diaspora is probably Min Jin-lee, and none other than Min Jin-lee. And obviously, there are many others who talk about story that has diasporic element, but perhaps not intentional, right? It's a byproduct. I think diaspora, not as a nationalistic sentiment, but as a universal, almost philosophical concept would be beneficial. And certainly I don't want to limit the scope of my story only to diaspora, but I do want my stories to reflect diasporic consciousness.
So there's sort of a positive impact that diaspora could have globally and even within Korea. So based on that, what is next for you? Oh, I hear that you're getting married in a couple of days.
Yes.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
After the marriage, after the honeymoon, what is next for Joseph in terms of your project?
I have many ideas in mind. I don't have the resources to execute them. But let's say a millionaire approaches me and say, make a documentary of your choice. I met this Korean-American doctor who serves kids with disabilities in North Korea. He's been there for the past 13 years. He told me that he's witnessing reunification on a daily basis. I found his story to be extremely compelling, and he's not an ideological person. He's a person of humanity. I think that's the zeitgeist of my generation, is to figure this out, right? The stalemate that we experience between South and North, and the division, and so many social ills that come out of division. Do you want a status quo? I mean, do you want to stay as is? Something needs to happen. Maybe I'll try to tackle that from very moving story of this one Korean American man living in North Korea, serving the most vulnerable population.
We're hoping a millionaire will come up and allow you to make this kind of documentary so that we can view it and talk again.
That'd be great.
So until that day, that's it for me. I'll be back next week with another globalist who's putting Korea on the map. Sun Jae out.